All right, it is the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Retention versus Records Management, What's the Difference? We appreciate you joining us today. The first thing I would like to do is take a moment and introduce our speakers. My name is Maya Woldridge, and I'm in business development here at Gimmal. And today I'm joined by our key speaker, Gimmal's Director of Sales Engineering, Dean Misenhimer. Now, before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we will answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will also be a couple of poll questions that you will see pop up, so please keep an eye out for those. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. To kick things off, I'd like to take the next couple of slides to tell you a little bit about Gimmal and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Founded in 2002, Gimmal is a records, information management, and governance software company that helps you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you are trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimmal can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. Gimmal's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migration, file analysis, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP. And in more recent news, Gimmal announced the acquisition of Sherpa Software last month, adding full data governance and e-discovery capabilities to the Gimmal Discover product suite. And now I'd like to go ahead and hand it off to you, Dean.
All right, thanks, Maya. Good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to talk a little bit today about retention and records management, a little bit about kind of what they both are, and really what's the difference between the two, because I think there can be confusion of, aren't they kind of one and the same? Don't they mean the same thing? So we'll start by talking about the information lifecycle, because really retention and records management are both part of that overall information lifecycle that your content's going to go through. If you think about it, as you create information in your organization, it goes through different stages in its life, right? Content gets created, it gets edited, it gets versioned, and eventually it gets retired or archived or deleted. Retention may happen throughout. And there are different models out there for the information lifecycle model. Some have 4 steps, some have 5, some have 6 steps. So there's a little debate as to what the exact steps are, depending on who you're looking at. But in general, it's kind of that same process. And as I mentioned, throughout, retention may be applied on content, and retention can kind of be defined as the use or possession of something until you get rid of it, right? You're retaining it, you're holding on to it, and at some point, you're getting rid of it. Records management, on the other hand, is a bit more of a discipline, and it's defined by AIM as a set of activities that are required to systematically control the use, maintenance, and disposition of information maintained as evidence of a business transaction. And I highlighted certain words for a reason, right? It's a systematic approach to controlling how information is used and ultimately disposing of that information and using it as evidence of a business transaction, right? And we'll get into a little bit of what the differences are there between the two. Here's one example of the information governance lifecycle. At the beginning of the lifecycle, step 1, you're creating new content. You're collaborating on that content. You may be going through multiple iterations and versions of that content, right? Think of a contract, think of a standard operating procedure, think of other content that you create. And at some point, you have a final document you store it, and it kind of gets, stored, used, searched for, used. And over time, you may repeat steps 1 through 3 as a cycle, right? A policy may need to be updated at some point in time. So I have the active policy, but I have a new version of the policy being created and going through its own life cycle, for changes that'll be made in the upcoming year, let's say. Retention may be applied on that information throughout those first 3 steps, where we're going to keep it for a period of time. Things that are draft copies, things like that, we'll get rid of. But at some point, depending on the content type, depending on where it's at in its life cycle, maybe a contract may be draft data, but once it's approved and executed, now it's a record. Now it may be subject to legal hold or e-discovery. Now it may need to be classified and retained more formally as a record, and then ultimately formally dispositioned. Or in some cases, depending on your business, if you are government, state, local, municipal governments, you may need to provide that record out to an archive, right? So content will move through this life cycle, and it may go through loops of this life cycle over its time. So let's drive a little deeper into specifically retention policies. Retention can be automated or it can be manual, right? And retention is typically applied a little differently depending on what the content is, right? So email archiving is probably one a lot of folks are familiar with. You get email, it sits in your inbox, maybe you put it in a folder underneath your inbox, but after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever your company's policy is, that email may get moved offline to an archive, or it may actually get disposed of. It may get deleted, right? And that just happens automatically. Your local C drive on your desktop or your laptop, it may have no retention on it. Stuff just sits there forever, right? OneDrive, information there may be kept for 24 months because OneDrive is really supposed to be an editing, a workplace, and things that once they're in a more final form should be moved out of OneDrive. But so, there may be a 2-year retention. SharePoint could have retention on it or not, depending on how SharePoint's been rolled out. In a lot of cases, that's automated, but it could be manual. There could just be a company policy that says, Maya, you should delete emails that are over 12 months old or move them out of your inbox. Or you should clean up your OneDrive every 18 months. And then, retention is a little different from records management because not everything that gets retained is necessarily a record. Again, think about the content you deal with day in and day out, the types of information that crosses your desk. Some of it may be a record, some of it's not. Contracts and legal agreements, probably a record. Employee files, medical records, those are records, right? Tax records, records in the name, so we'll say yes. Standard operating procedures or policies, most likely, right? The draft copies of them may not be, but the final approved standard operating procedure probably is, right? To-do lists, probably not. Your lunch calendar, no. But memos and correspondence, maybe. It depends on what's in the memo or what's in the correspondence. If I get an email that says, want to go to lunch, that's not a record. If I get an email that says, please make the following changes to this clause in the contract, and then the contract is approved for execution, that's probably a record, right? So how you need to manage the information can be context sensitive, and it can be, just depend on what it is.
Yeah, I'll hop in here to ask our first poll question. Do you have a retention or records management policies in place today? And it should be popping up here on the screen. There it is.
Yeah, so take a moment, look at the questions and answer. Do you have basic retention in place today, right? Your email disappears after 18 months, or things on your file share are moved or locked down after a period of time. Those are retention policies. Or do you have more formal records management policies, right? Records are classified against a formal retention schedule, put into a record class. There's a formal process for the disposition of those records, right? Kind of where are you at in your information management maturity today in your organization? And as we tabulate the votes up furiously here in the background, we'll pop the results up on the screen. So good. 50% of you almost have a formal records management program in place, and another 25% have retention policies. So you guys are doing a good job of making sure information's not just collecting out there. Oops, let me get to the next slide here. There we go. Retention is, in a lot of ways, it's focused on remediation more than compliance. It's about reducing the volume of information. That's why I want to put retention on things, right? So that over a period of time, information doesn't just collect, it's going to get chopped down and managed. Right, so it's focused on minimizing rot. Right, you've heard us use that term in other webinars: redundant, obsolete, and trivial content, and generating cost savings. Right, maintaining compliance is kind of can be a secondary benefit of retention, right? But it's not the primary focus, right? Rot, one, it just takes up space on your hard drives, in your SharePoint environment, in your email. It is sucking up digital resources. But in addition to that, it's just making it harder for you to do your job. Excuse me. If you've gone out and you've searched, let's say, for a contract, or you've searched for a policy, or you've searched for a specification, right, across your network, how many times have you gotten back just 10 or 12 documents that are exactly what you're looking for? You're usually getting back 100 or 200 documents in a set of search results, unless you build a really, really granular search. And a lot of it is information that may be 3, 5, 7, 10 years old, right? Depending on how long information's been stored on your network. So it makes it hard to do your job oftentimes when you have all of this dated information out there that's no longer relevant. Or even worst case, you make business decisions using out-of-date information because you've found the wrong version of something that's now been superseded out, but it didn't show up in your search results, or you didn't see it in the list. And a lot of folks will argue, well, storage is cheap. Well, hardware storage has definitely gotten cheaper. If you've been in high tech and around IT for any length of time, the cost of storing digital information is absolutely plummeted. But the management of storage is not cheap, right? There's still a defined cost in what it takes to manage your infrastructure, in maintaining and backing up that information, the amount of time it takes to back it up, to index for search that information, to run file analytics across that information. The more bloated your information source is, the longer that all takes, and you're not saving money. And so retention management, is often implemented at a system level, and it's really driven by IT in a lot of cases. There may be input from other organizations, but the kind of basic retention policies are driven in the various systems by IT. A lot of times it's simple date-based stuff, right? From the date received for email, keep it 18 months, 12 months, whatever, do an action. For documents on the file system, keep them for X number of time. For information in SharePoint, last modified date plus. And they're designed to be broadly applied, right? Retention is about a broad brush application of that retention. In different repositories, there are different ways to enable that. If you're familiar with SharePoint on-premise, SharePoint has had what they call Information Management Policy, or IMPS for short, for a lot of years, right? Dating back at least to SharePoint 2010. And they can be used to set up basic retention on information as it's added to a library, or by the type of information it is, content type in SharePoint. And it can look at created, last modified, or other date fields, add a value to it, and then after that period of time, delete the information. Microsoft 365, right, provides a number of different ways to manage retention of information, right? Security Compliance Center introduced both retention policies as well as labels. So you can set up policies that can be applied on the site. And again, it's a bit of a broad brush, but everything in the site falls into the retention policy. Or I can set up retention labels that can be applied on specific documents or emails, across my different content storage locations in Microsoft 365. Or they can be applied automatically if you're using an E5 license, right? You can use the AI and machine learning capabilities that Microsoft 365 to automatically apply labels once you kind of build out the models. And then email, right? Email can have labels applied to it. If you're in Microsoft 365, email archiving can also apply retention on email and then dispose of or take care of email after a period of time. So there are different ways to implement it, but it's really designed to be kind of a broad brush, and it's really, I would argue, almost more of an IT function. These are some screenshots out of Microsoft 365, out of Security and Compliance Center. And there's a lot of different ways to set up your policies, to set up your labels. You can pick and choose where those are going to be applied. And there's even some overlap in where I can set some of these things up. And, as always, Microsoft continues to make changes to Microsoft 365. So where you set some things up today may not be the same place you set them up tomorrow, because they'll change the administration console. But you can set up labels. Those labels can be automatically applied. Those labels can have a retention period. And interestingly, I can set up a label or a policy that gets applied to something, puts a 7-year retention on something, and at the end of the 7 years, it does nothing. And that's actually the retention policy. So again, when you look at it, from a UI perspective, it's really more, to me, more of an IT function and oriented towards an IT organization. And realistically, retention by itself isn't enough. So retention solves the problem of large volumes of information, but it doesn't really solve specific compliance challenges. First, retention policies are typically going to be platform specific. The different repositories you're using, the different systems you're using may have their own way of implementing and managing retention. SharePoint and SharePoint Online are a simple example. Second, the policies are pretty broad in nature, right? They don't classify information necessarily specifically based on kind of a granular set of information. It's a broad brush. And then throughout the retention cycle, at the end of it, when information is ready for going to be deleted, there's not really a formal approval process that happens there. And then you don't have the reporting and the visibility. And this is where we start to cross over into records management and that whole compliance world, where we need that systematic control over what's happening. Right. So if we look at managing compliance and talk about records management, and I'm going to use that same definition here again, but it really is about maintaining compliance, whether those compliance policies are internal policies, whether they are government mandated policies, whether they are industry regulations, and quite frankly, if you're a multinational company, could be a combination of all of them, and they could vary depending on the countries you're doing business in, right? So it can quickly become rather complex. But it's about maintaining compliance and reducing risk in the case of e-discovery and things like that. So, again, using the same definition, records management is defined as a set of activities for systematically controlling the use, maintenance, and disposition of information maintained as evidence of business activities. Right, so it is about doing things in, quite frankly, a repeatable, systematic approach. It's about classifying and organizing information, and it's about having defensibility in what you're doing. Right, regulatory compliance. There are regulations and guidelines, again, depending on your industry, what you do, that define how long records should be retained and how they should be disposed of or archived. Because disposition doesn't always mean delete. One good example, if you want to take a look at a records retention schedule, is the general record schedule published by the U.S. National Archive. The link is here at the bottom of the slide, and we will be sending the slides out, so you'll have that. But you can go take a look at it, and it categorizes records into specific record classes and categories. It defines the retention for each one of those. It talks about what happens at the end of the retention period, right? Whether records are going to be transferred, disposed of, transferred then disposed of, marked as permanent, kept forever, right? There are a number of different options beyond keep it for 5 years and delete it. And records management is also about reducing risk, right? One, if I'm deleting employee files, or if I'm a consumer packaged goods company and I'm deleting recipes over time for batches of my product, right? I can ensure, if I'm using a systematic approach, that I'm keeping those the same way. And then when it comes time to dispose of them, the approval cycle and the disposition process is the same. I'm not being selective in how that's applied. And that's the type of things that will allow you to defend your process, right? We're not selectively deleting information. We're doing it the same way every time, right? And we can back that up. So, records management applications, which are software applications that provide the records management capabilities, give us those management functions to do all of this, to locate and to categorize information, right? Contracts are managed one way, but not just contracts. Property contracts might be one way, real estate contracts another, vendor contracts differently, right? I can start to get very granular in how I'm managing information. And then, I can categorize and identify things that are eligible for disposition. So once I've kept them through, I can run reports and I can see and I can make approvals on, okay, I can see what's coming up for expiration, for example, over the next quarter or between now and the end of this year, right? I've got that type of visibility now. And so a records management application is designed to give you really one way to manage all of your records. Now, there are different approaches. There's a centralized approach, and there's kind of an in-place records management approach. Centralized is kind of the historical way of doing records management. You had a records management system. It had all the records management functions, but to manage the records, they all had to be put into the repository of that system. So everything had to be centralized into one location. So, if the record was in SharePoint, it needed to be moved out of SharePoint. If it's on the file system, it needs to be moved off the file system and put into the records repository. And you can't see my air quotes there. In-place records management is about centrally managing the policy, but then letting the records remain in place in SharePoint or on the file system or in Box or wherever they may be, and then managing that record where it's at rest, not having to move it and not having to disrupt the end user experience who's just trying to get their job done. Right? And the records management applications then provide that central file plan management. So I can set up, whether it's the general record schedule or another system, I can create my classification structure. I can model it to meet the needs of my business. I can associate retention to categories of record classes or to individual record classes, and I can manage that. My retentions can be complex. They can be multi-year, multi-stage, right? I may classify all of Maya's employee files as soon as they're stored into a repository, but I may not trigger retention as long as she's an active employee. Maya goes out over the weekend, wins the lottery, shows up next Monday, says, I'm retiring. Now we're going to terminate Maya. So we may want to lock all of her employee files so they're now immutable, no longer changeable. Then I keep them for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, I want to dispose of them. But the HR, the records coordinator for HR may need to approve that. right? I can model those types of retention life cycles and trigger the retention off of any properties I have, whether it's a metadata property, a custom date field, or event-based triggers. And I can do disposition approval. I can set up disposition workflows so that to dispose of a record, Maya has to do the first level approval, I have to do the second level approval, right? Then the record gets disposed of, and that's all captured and tracked and managed. And there was a question in the Q&A, and I'll go ahead and hit it now, that a lot of retention is event based, and that's a good example. The employee termination is one example. If you're in energy, oil and gas, utilities, other operating environments, a lot of times there are capital assets that get retired, and when those assets get retired, you want to trigger retention on all their records. We had one client that leased aircraft. When a specific tail number for an aircraft was retired, that's when they would trigger retention. And so the event date, typically with event-based retention, I have a common trigger such as employee termination or asset retirement. But then specific instances of that event will get created in the system, and that can be done by a records manager if you want to manually control the process. It can be done automatically through an API, so your HR system or your ERP system may trigger the creation of that event, and the event has an effective date, and that's what would then trigger the beginning of the retention clock. So good question, by the way. So records management, the records management applications are designed for records managers. It provides all of the functions they need in one place to be able to centrally manage your records and then deploy your records policies across the organization. And more importantly, it gives them a single view of all the records being managed. If I have records in SharePoint Online, a file share, Box, and a FileNet repository, I can have one file plan and retention schedule. I can reach into all of those repositories and I can apply my classification and retention consistently across all of those, and I can see that from one place as a records manager. I have the ease of use because the system's designed for records managers with terminology familiar to records managers and with the tools that a records manager needs. Plus, I have the control, right? I can trigger and mark records as immutable at a point in their life cycle. And I can lock those records in their respective repositories. So now the record might be sitting in SharePoint or the record might be sitting in FileNet, but I can trigger it and lock it so it's no longer editable in the repository, so I can ensure the integrity of that record. And I can control not just electronic records, but I can also apply the same policy and classification and retention to my physical records. So again, I've got one point of control for all records, electronic and physical. And then I've got the reporting, I've got the single view for disposition approval. I've got one way to manage all of this information. And just to kind of drill in a little bit and give you some ideas of what some of this looks like, my file plan can be hierarchical, for example, right? It doesn't have to be a simple flat structure. I can nest things down. I can nest things to whatever level makes sense from a business standpoint. I can organize records into case files. The clear folders you see there indicate, for all of my departmental administration records, well, I'm going to collect them into record cases by department. So then when it comes time to manipulate certain records for certain things, for whether it's for legal hold, event triggering, disposition, I can easily do that. Right? I can trigger that retention like we talked about a moment ago, a variety of different ways. I can use date fields, and not just common date fields like created and last modified, any custom date field. Or I can look at any property. I can look at the folder name to see if somebody put it in a folder called final. It could be that simple. Or I can look at a property where somebody clicked a checkbox that says case is closed. That may trigger retention. or we can do event-based retention as we talked about, and I can model those life cycles to be as simple or as complex as I need them to be. And then ultimately, the end goal, at the end of the retention life cycle, I can have a more formal review and approval of records from a common inbox. So I can see record cases that are eligible for disposition. I can see records from different repositories eligible for disposition. I can sort and filter that inbox, right? So, because I can have hundreds of records eligible for disposition potentially. And I can do bulk actions, right? All of the records in a specific record class that are currently eligible for disposition, let me approve them. Or, an entire page of records that I'm looking at, let me approve it. Or maybe I decide to reject disposition, right? And again, as we talked about earlier, that disposition action doesn't always mean delete. It could be something like transfer a copy of the record so that we're going to send it to NARA, the National Archive, or we're going to send it to a state archive, or mark a record as permanent so it will never be deleted, right? And that's tracked in the system, and that all becomes part of the audit trail, right? And so the tools in the interface are designed to allow a records manager to easily do that, and from Gimmal, that's where Gimmal Records fits in and Gimmal Physical fits in, right? It provides that web-based environment to connect to your different repositories, to have that common view, to be able to manage, across the ribbon there at the top of the UI, to be able to manage your file plan, as well as have that visibility into all of your records out there, right? So that you've got consistency in how you manage your information. And so that kind of takes us to the end. Maya, I'll flip it over to you for this last poll question here.
Yeah, I got a quick poll question that's going to pop up. If you are interested in a personalized demonstration of Gimmal records or any of our other solutions, let us know here in the poll and we'd be happy to reach out.
And so while we wait on the poll question, I'll go ahead and just move over to while we wait for everybody to answer the poll. Here we go. I'll move over and we can address any questions that are coming up here.
Sure. First question. We have a records retention schedule software that manages our retention schedule. Is that enough?
The records retention management software is typically, the products I'm familiar with, they're oriented at creating the retention schedule, helping you put that retention schedule together, tracking all of the citations and legal guidelines and everything else that dictate, oh, this is why you need to keep this record this is long, this is how long you need to keep it, and more importantly, keeping you apprised of updates. So they really manage that research database and the creation of the tool, the creation of the retention schedule. What they don't do is the application of that retention schedule. And that's where a records management application like Gimmal Records comes into play. We can take that retention schedule that one of those tools can help you create, and then import it and apply it.
All right, I've got another quick question here before we wrap it up. You mentioned in place, the term in place a couple of times when talking about records management. Can you define what exactly that means?
Yeah, it basically means not moving the binary file, right? So I create a Word document, I store it in SharePoint 2019, right? Now it's stored there, we can all collaborate on it. Well, in a centralized records management approach, at some point in that records lifecycle, I would have to pick it up, move it out of SharePoint into another repository for it to fall under records control. In place means the record never has to leave SharePoint. I create my Word document, I store it in SharePoint. Gimmal Records crawls it, classifies it against the appropriate record class, and now retention triggers at the proper point in time. The record may be locked in SharePoint at the proper time, and at the end of its retention, the record is deleted from SharePoint. It never has to leave that location. So for your end users, it's business as usual, right? They don't get disrupted by the records management process. That's what in-place records management means.
All right. Well, we're a few minutes over on time. So if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to reference our contact information there on the screen. You can also send us an email at info@gimmal.com or visit our website at www.gimmal.com. And for those interested in a recording of this webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 and 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. And we also hope to see you for our webinar next week, getting started with an information governance maturity model. Thank you everyone for joining us.